Hello, everyone. This is exciting. And what number conference is this of like all of them? 15, I think, something along those lines. Wow. We should have like a cake or something if it's 15. But but no, it's great to be here. And Liza, thanks for joining us. And I'm really, I was excited to be able to interview you because you've had a really amazing career, and it's just amazing in not only the brands and companies and roles you've played, but also just the different industries and the different vantage points you have to bring. I mean, I want to
Like
summarize.
such a nice way of saying you're very old and sort of schizophrenic.
And you're not done yet. You're still moving. So, clearly, you're just getting started. Let's just put it that way. Well, I wouldn't say that because you've done quite a bit here, but there's a lot to learn from you. You kind of earlier on in your career, you were leading business development at IBM, business development at this company Flues, 10 years at Citi. And this is the years kind of 2000 to 2010, roughly, which is a period of time when you were overseeing the American consumer internet and mobile business for Citi, which is kind of a really interesting time to be doing that. And then managing director at BlackRock, CMO at E-Trade. I'm curious how you moved to a CMO type role. We'll talk about that. President at Jet, which Zach just mentioned. Went into VC and then left VC. We have that in common. And then CEO of a company called Stash until just recently, and on a few incredible boards. So maybe, well, first of all, I know it's hard to pick a favorite experience that you've had, but I am curious, like, what experience do you feel had the most impact on you in terms of learning? What made you most who you are today?
That's a good question. I think there are probably two super formative professional experiences for me. One was really early in my career at IBM, which is not nearly as cool and sexy as it sounds. That's a joke. IBM is
but probably
cool
a good place to get started. I mean,
yeah. Well, the reason I was going to say I think it's so formative is that IBM did something then, and I think they still do it, that I don't think a lot of companies do anymore, which is they actually invest in teaching you how to be a good people manager and developer of talent and manager of teams. I've thought about this a lot in my subsequent career. I feel like there is this sort of famine of good managers around the planet. And I think in part it's because people make this very rational decision, which is if everyone's going to move every 2 years, why should I be the person who invests in making them better? Because they'll be more valuable for someone else. But maybe that I'm attributing too much like volition to this choice, and maybe it's just budgets. But my experience now, having gotten to manage a lot of people and having the opportunity to manage a lot of managers over multiple decades, is I think people are getting less good at it because it's not an innate human skill that people are born with. You actually have to be taught how to do it. So I think IBM for that, because they really invested a lot in sort of, at least my personal, but I think a whole cohort of us, our development as people leaders and managers. And then Citi, both because the organization and the industry went through such a radical transformation during the decade I was there, but also Citi is the first place I was working where instead of just saying like, oh, this job you're offering me seems like a good job, I at some point kind of figured out that I should start crafting and asking for the role that I wanted, as opposed to being sort of a passive recipient. And that, I think, was a really formative lesson in my career.
Those are two great lessons. I think I think a lot of us feel like we're living our careers at the mercy of circumstance to some degree, and to kind of take the reins.
Yeah.
And say, oh wait, I should be the architect.
Yeah, we were talking about this before. I've been on the board of Squarespace since 2018, and Scott knows Anthony, who's the founder and CEO there. And Anthony and I talk about all the time this phenomenon, which I describe, if only we knew the people running the joint.
Right.
Where if you're a board member, oftentimes like a CEO or a senior person will say some version of like, they won't, or like, we don't, blah, blah. And I'm like, wait, aren't you the CEO?
Right.
Like, don't you get to decide what the culture is? Like, aren't you guys the executive team? Like, who's the they?
Yeah.
Like, don't you have agency in this? And I think agency is probably the most important lesson you can learn in life, not just at work. Okay, that's my soapbox for today.
That's a good one. I think that actually, we always blame the environmental factors for everything. And in essence, and it's easy when you're not the boss, but then when you are the boss, you're like, oh, it's the board, or oh, it's the market, or oh, the customers don't get it, or. And at some point, you just have to say, it's my mind to solve.
I'm like, um, external factors impact everyone.
Yeah,
So in some ways they level the playing field. Arguably, there's some, during COVID, if you're an in-person business, you're probably impacted differently than remote
yeah,
businesses. So fair enough. But all in-person businesses were impacted that way. And so I always, when I'm interviewing people or meeting companies as an investor, and I get the like external factors, blah, blah, I'm like, okay, but
yeah,
then what did you do?
right. Which is, that's where the rubber hits the road here. It's so let's talk a little bit about life in between kind of public companies and private companies. First of all, I'm curious if there's a difference. I mean, you've really done both at scale in different ways. I'm curious like what your reflections are of the key differences, and then I'd love to talk a little bit about getting into the venture capital world.
Sure. I mean, look, I think some of the difference between public and private is relatively like obvious on its face, which is the pace and cadence
Yeah.
is different, and the constituencies you're trying to make happy are different. I think one of the great, I will say, like joys and freedoms inside private companies is that you are less subject to whatever is fashionable in the public markets at the moment.
Hmm.
Now you are somewhat subject to what is fashionable inside the private markets, and that can be equally illogical and seemingly random.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think it creates more sort of it's a more liberal environment to operate under, lowercase l.
Yep.
I happen to be a fan of the cleansing sunshine of public markets. I do
Hmm.
think it causes people to have to like think differently about the infrastructure of their business and the transparency of their business. And in some markets with some shareholder bases, it allows you to think about a longer arc of time, which I think generally is healthier for business.
Hmm.
But that is a little bit of a depends who's on your board, depends
Right.
on the composition of your shareholder base. And I do think um, it's also a little bit of a, not all public companies are created equally.
Yep.
When you think about Walmart as an example, which I haven't checked in the last couple of weeks, but like for most
You're
of,
doing well.
yeah, I was gonna say, for most of my grown-up life, they have
Yep.
been the Fortune 1 or in the
Yep.
Fortune 10. Um, if you talk to Doug, who is the CEO there, who probably, if he ran, would probably be the only Republican I would ever vote for in my
Right.
life. Like, I just think he's so amazing. Um, yeah, it's not funny today, is it?
We got to politics in about 6 minutes.
That's, hey, I haven't started openly weeping or drinking, so we're doing well. But he would tell you that a big part of his job is working for the family because the biggest like group of shareholders of Walmart is still the Walton family.
Yeah.
That is very different than a lot of public companies that have a really diverse group of shareholders.
Yep.
So his job as the CEO of a public company is very different than a CEO of a public company with a really diverse
Totally.
shareholder base.
I mean, I think it's a good example. It's one of the largest companies in the country. I think they have over 1 million employees, and he's I mean, he really acts like a steward.
Mhm.
And I guess as we generalize companies, public, private, it's really all about the people. To your earlier point, and also I identify with this point about it's easier to be misunderstood for long periods of time as a private company.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's really hard to be misunderstood at any moment in time as a public company, which I've also learned. So okay, so then switching to NEA. So you've had some amazing experiences. You clearly have both the finance background as well as the operating and leadership background. NEA, of course, is a great venture capital firm that invests in private startups. What made you take the leap? And I'm curious about what your kind of learnings were there.
Um, you know, it's a little bit of, I mean, this is going to be a theme. Like for me, it was a lot about the people. It wasn't that I woke up one morning and was like, gee, I'd like to be a venture capitalist. I'm always amazed. One of the things I did at NEA was help reshape the associate program. And I would meet these amazing young people who were usually like in their first or second year in an analyst program at usually Morgan Stanley or Goldman. And they would be like, I have wanted to be a venture capitalist since I was 12. And I was like, I didn't know what a venture capitalist was when I was 12. I'm not sure I still know what a venture capitalist does. But I didn't have that. It's that I got to know a lot of people at NEA from my time at Jet. NEA were early and frequent investors in Jet. Tony Florence, who was running the tech practice at NEA when I joined, was on our board. He was kind of like my wartime consigliere. And after the rocket ship that was Jet, I mean, Zach said this, we raised a ton of money. We got to 1.3 billion in sales in 13 months, 7 million customers, 3,000 employees, like crazy town.
Yeah, I want to talk about it in a second, but keep going.
I was trying to decide between a couple of operating roles, and I took Tony out for dinner, and I was like, I'm going to buy you dinner for a change. So you can tell me like which of these things you think is a better idea. And he was like, I actually have a better idea. Like, why don't you come hang out with us for a while and like see what you want to see. And the thing that I really found compelling about it is that venture, and I think to a certain extent private equity as well, are one of the few places on the planet, maybe outside of academia, where you get paid to be intellectually promiscuous, which is not a thing that is afforded to you as an operator.
That is true.
And so it's sort of like really scratched this kind of intellectual magpie thing that I have where I like to like pick up different things and learn about them. And that I found completely compelling. It also, it allows you to not be so single-threaded. Like I love operating and there's a lot of code switching in operating, but there's code switching like within a lane. And I would have days at NEA where I was like working on a women's health company in the morning and then working on like e-commerce enablement supply chain company in the afternoon. And like, that's just quite freeing.
Yeah.
Rather than like, okay, I work in consumer finance. All I'm going to think about is what the OCC is going to say for like the next 10 years.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think the point about just being able to explore any field and go deep and not have to, you're not being accountable to what tasks did I check the box on today and what, how's the quarter looking? It's more so about these existential insights that yield investments that actually you won't even know if they're good or bad decisions for 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you. Like that was one of the hardest things for me. I went to Cornell undergrad.
High achiever.
Very competitive. Like I never let my kids win games. Like when the first time my daughter like beat me at Connect 4, she was like, probably not a great thing to share about myself publicly, I just realized. But it's, you don't know if you're good at investing for a long time. And that is very hard it was like hard for me to get used to that. And also hard to get used to the idea that like, there's not something you're supposed to be doing. The first 6 months I worked in venture, I made a classic transition mistake, which is that I filled up my calendar completely because I was so used to having a filled calendar that I would take meetings with anyone. And some of that is good because you're sort of taste testing a lot of things. But also, like, I burned a lot of my own calories and other people's calories because I thought I was supposed to be busy. And I didn't realize how much time is required to like think and read and like explore things kind of inside yourself. It has a very different like pace and cadence than operating.
I agree. I had a similar experience, going from operating into Benchmark, where I was building products and teams, and then went suddenly to like, no, you don't manage any team, you don't build anything, and you fill your team time with meetings all day. And I kind of felt a little depressed at times because I felt like I had sort of hung up my spurs too early to some degree. And I also just missed the stuff that I felt I was overwhelmed by when I was leaving it, like all the team building and everything else. I think there's something about the operator that
Well, this is why, I mean, you and I are the classic examples of why venture capital firms should hire operators, but are also wary of hiring operators because eventually many of us get the bug and go back,
Right.
which you did and I did.
Yeah, so you did. And I guess NEA was an investor in Stash.
Yes.
And so you're, I guess, working with them to some degree, and somehow you get drafted into coming back to Stash and becoming the CEO.
Yeah, I mean, NEA was a small investor in Stash. And when NEA invested, another one of my partners made the investment. He was like, well, you should take the board because you actually know about this stuff. And maybe like 4 months after I got there, the founders and board were like, hey, actually, you should be the CEO because of like where the company is going next. And I had been thinking about going back to operating, but I will admit I had the great privilege and luxury of kind of saying like, well, I'd only do it for something that I like was really into.
Yeah.
There are, I mean, I don't know if you had this experience as an investor, and those of you in the audience who are investors, I looked at a lot of companies as an investor where I was like, this is a great investment, but this company, like, I don't understand why it exists in the world.
Right.
And that would just really annoy me.
Yep.
Like so many smart people spending so much time on something that just does not matter at all. This is probably why like I couldn't stay in investing, because sometimes those are still amazing investments, but you're like, why? Like, is the 75th like SaaS company really like the thing that's going to change the world? So I'd already fallen in love with the mission at Stash, and I mean, this is not a nice way to say it, but it's the way I think about it. I really missed worrying about one thing deeply as opposed to a lot of things shallowly.
Yep.
And I don't say that lightly because I think most venture capitalists worry about their companies deeply. But I think the best analogy, and many of you are too young to get this, but I actually won't make eye contact with the older people in the audience, but you know who you are, is that for me, operating is like the relationship, not in a paternalistic way, but the way with your children. Like their happiness is your happiness. You go to sleep worrying about them, you wake up worrying about them. I think being an investor is kind of like being an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, in that you're emotionally engaged, but at the end of the day, you get to give the baby back.
Right.
And that is just fundamentally a different value proposition as a human being.
Yeah.
And I like missed the deep worry.
Yeah. I think that's really well said. All right, so I know I'm switching gears here, but I would love to talk a little bit about Jet, because as a kind of bystander just watching this whole thing, it was dizzying to me how
It was
fast
pretty
the company,
dizzying on the
yeah,
inside.
I'm sure. And you know, and there's also a part of me that looked at the whole thing being like, was just like like a secret agenda from Walmart to just get this startup to make something that would end up revolutionizing them. I mean, it was just sort of, it's almost, I know that wasn't, but it was a.
I actually don't think it was a secret agenda.
Yeah.
I think that was the agenda.
Okay. Well, enlighten us. Like how did this get formed? How did you raise one of the largest seed rounds in history? How did this company get to sales, material sales so quickly and get acquired so quickly? Like what happened here?
Okay, so I have a rule. This is going to sound like a non sequitur, but it's not. Just go with me for a minute. I have a rule that I will connect with pretty much anyone on LinkedIn if they reach out to me, unless in the little blurb they use to describe themselves, they just use the word visionary. This is like a hard no for me, like super hard no. Now, I say that and you ask like, how do all these things happen? So when I use the word visionary, I do not use it lightly because it typically makes me throw up in my mouth a little bit.
Okay, fair enough.
Mark Lower, who founded Jet and previously to that founded Quidsy, is now the founder of Wonder, which just acquired Grubhub and many other things. Yep. He's very acquisitive.
Yeah.
Actually is a visionary. He is a person who wakes up in the morning and thinks, 10 years from now, people will be buying things by blinking their eyes. I've made that up. That's not a thing he said to me. But I have had similar conversations with him where I'm just like, what? Can I curse here? Like, what the fuck are you talking about? That is insane. Right. And everything from like some big idea about how the world is going to evolve, but also like we had been live for 6 weeks, and we launched as a membership model. People don't remember this. And I would say 90% of the most meaningful business conversations and even personal conversations Mark and I had were by text. He's a big texter. He called me on a Friday night at like 11 o'clock. And I was like, oh, this is not going to be good if he's actually. He was like, I have an idea. What if we were no longer a membership model, but we were free to everyone? And instead of trying to get to $1 billion of GMV in 2 years, we did it in the first year. It's like, okay, well, that's an interesting thought experiment. And he was like, could you actually plan what that would look like over the weekend? Like, but the reason I use this as an example is that part of how I think we truly achieved really extraordinary things from a growth perspective is that he has no failure of imagination ever. And his imagination is bigger than most people. And he surrounds himself with people who are willing often to be like, all right, well, that seems impossible, but let's just like game out whether there's actually any way in the known universe that this could be true. And if so, we'll take a shot at it.
Right.
I would say the big secret of why Jet was able to do those things so quickly and relatively well, although we screwed up a lot of things, is that we were really good at failing well together as a group of humans. Like it's one of the few places I've ever worked where when things like went really badly, it actually made all of us like each other more, trust each other more, and work together better. There are lots of places where I have had the opposite experience, where like things, and if you think about, I spent a lot of my life working in and out of large public companies in finance in some pretty tumultuous markets. You know, I remember my CFO at Citi in 2008 imparting these great words of wisdom to me, which is shrinking pie environments do not bring out the best in humanity. And that was just not true at Jet. Like I'm still super close with most of the people I worked with there, even though we haven't worked together in, you know, 7
Well, it
or 8
speaks to
years.
the culture that was created, and it also, you know, speaks to, I think there are probably some visionaries or people who maybe just describe themselves on LinkedIn as visionaries, who don't want to hire the people that will kind of game out how it might not work, you
Yeah.
know. And it sounds like he's someone who wants to have that chemistry of the people who will challenge and round out, but then also a group of people that are willing to take a leap and learn from it.
Yeah. I mean, like I didn't list that as a place that I learned a lot, but that's because I'm spoiled for choice.
Yeah.
I mean, I learned so much from working with him and with that team, but also like I went directly to Jet from E-Trade, which was a turnaround at the time. It was like one of the few financial institutions in America that did not take TARP money and badly needed it. And it was sort of just like emerging when I joined. And it was a really fun and interesting time to work there, but it was like regulated by 7 different financial regulators. Then I went to Jet, which was like, and I was employee 16, so no product, no revenue, no nothing, just cash and a big idea. And it was probably the most liberating experience I've ever had. And I learned how to like just start by assuming yes and then work backwards as to the how. Now, sometimes that actually produced some very bad results, but more good than bad.
Was the Walmart acquisition something that was a result of a long relationship over the course of that venture that Mark had with the company, or did it come up suddenly?
No. So we had an investor, this great guy, Lev Casas, who had been in an earlier round, and he had run Walmart International.
Oh, I see.
And when we were previously, not when he invested in us, but when we were going to raise a round, he introduced Mark to the corporate venture people at Walmart. Through that, we started having conversations with Doug and the executive team there. And part of that discussion was, okay, well, what is the other side? If we invest and we're wildly successful, what does this look like long term? And I think we had the kind of when Harry met Sally moment, which is like when you know, like you want to spend the rest of your life with someone, you want the rest of your life to start right away.
Yep.
Has nobody seen Harry Met Sally? That's your homework. So thank you. So it really was actually pretty quick. We got from like, oh, you're going to put a lot of money into us to like, actually, no, we should just get married. And I would say, look, you know, if you had asked any one of my friends at the time, like if you made a list of 1,000 things that might appear in one of my bottomless purses, would Walmart employee badge be on that list? No would be the answer. I found Walmart fascinating. I thought the people were amazing. It's some of the best operators I've ever worked with. Like I thought I knew scale because I had worked at BlackRock and Citigroup and IBM, like big ass companies. I think they've shed some people since then, but at the time Walmart acquired us, they had 2.3 million employees worldwide, which is third to, I believe, the Indian Railway Authority and the Chinese Liberation Army.
Right.
And then Walmart. They just have people who know how to do scale in a way that very few other humans know how to do it. And I really appreciated that about them.
Sounds like a phenomenal experience.
It was great.
So, so I think quickly, let's talk about AI a little bit. I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on this because you've seen, a bunch of different types of companies probably trying to navigate what AI means for them. We also talked earlier briefly about management. And, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is a lot of us are made into managers without any sort of experience managing. And in some weird way, I actually wonder if AI can help us become better managers
I hope so.
of people. But what are your thoughts on AI and sort of how it will change labor?
Well, I was going to say we should clock how far into this we got. I'm actually really proud of us that we went that long without talking about AI. So look, there was a really interesting study that was done maybe like 5 or 6 years ago at kind of one of the earlier instantiations of AI that looked at what happened to telephone operators. Because that's how telephones used to work. Like humans used to switch calls, and then technology made that obsolete. And it actually, all of those women, it was primarily women, found jobs doing other things. I think there are a couple of ways that AI is going to change labor. I don't think it's going to cause like massive unemployment at a rate level. I do think it's going to shift the way labor occurs. I also think it's particularly going to be impactful for entry-level employees because the expectation around what people will have to be able to get done, like themselves, because there are so many more tools. So my daughter is 23. She graduated from Colby. Neither one of my kids had any interest in going to Cornell, even though both my husband and I are grads. Go figure. And she works at a philanthropic organization overseeing their like grant process. Probably 50% of the things that I thought she would be spending her time on, she is spending no time on because she actually uses AI to do them. So like create an RFP for no, I don't have to do that. I'm using AI. Like actually review, like first pass of review of the RFPs, of the responses. No, I don't have to do that. Like AI is doing that for me. And so I think those are the kinds of shifts. And I think we're going to see that up and down, like seniority levels. And so the expectation around what each individual can produce and the caliber of that, I think is going to go up. I mean, there are lots of things around like, can we write code faster? Like, can humans spend more time on things that require subjectivity and judgment and less on both rote and also like high volume tasks? I think that's good. I'm not like an AI doom person. Like I don't think like Terminator is happening anytime soon. But also, post 2016, I'm out of the prediction business, so don't quote me on that. But I do think it's going to mean that we all have to raise our level of play, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
One more question that I'd love to see if the audience has any questions for you as well. And it's just about the board roles. And you're on the board of Squarespace now. I know you've had a number of different boards you've been involved with, probably also on the nonprofit side, I imagine,
Yeah.
over the years. I just joined the board of a public company called Atlassian, so maybe you can also give me some advice on how, as an operator,
It's a great company.
can you really add value to a board, but also like respecting the lines of unless you're willing to be pulled in and be made an operator by them, which has happened to you a couple times. But what are your thoughts on being a great board member?
So years ago, before we had kids and I still had time to play golf with my husband, my father-in-law gave us great advice about playing golf together. And I think it's really applicable for board members as well.
Golf and boards seem to go well together. So
Yeah, I know I don't like golf, just to be clear, but I like my husband.
We'll roll with it. Let's do it.
So this was the advice, which is only offer advice when it is asked for. Only actually offer the specific advice that is asked for unless there are alligators on the course. And I actually think broadly this applies to being a good board member, which is mostly your role is to be responsive, ask good questions, and like provide the outside perspective and kind of distance that people who are like in the scrum don't necessarily have. But sometimes like you actually can see things they can't see, and that is your job and obligation to point that out.
Yeah.
And look, I think the hardest thing for operators coming into boards, I know it was for me when I first started being on boards, is not being like, but here's the answer.
Right.
Like, okay,
here's what I would do.
Here's what I would do.
Right.
Like when I was, coming up, we often blah, blah, blah. Nobody wants to hear that shit. I mean, they really don't. I think there are some like basic rules of civility that I think are really important in boards. And also things like, this is going to seem obvious, I'm sure you do this, but I've had the experience on a lot of boards where people don't do this, like actually get to learn the industry of the board you're on. Like I'm on a hotel company board. I've never worked in hospitality. I don't know. When I first joined the board, I actually had to spend a lot of time learning the industry so that I didn't ask stupid ass questions in the board meeting and waste everybody's time. That's actually really important. And I think the other thing for board members is recognizing, in the same way if you are in a senior role someplace, you think you're asking a question, but the people hearing it think you're making a point.
Right.
And so you have to be really thoughtful about like, is this just something I'm intellectually curious about? Or is this actually a discussion that's appropriate for the board? But I actually really love board work. I think it is deeply fulfilling. And I also think as one gets more senior in your career, there aren't the same kinds of learning opportunities. And so getting to be in a room with a lot of other really smart, accomplished people who have done very different things from you, like is a great way to spend time.
Yeah, I agree. And so far the learning curve is, steep, and it's fun you almost feel like you're eavesdropping on a company and how it's actually being run.
No, it's very true.
Which is really fun. All right. Well, thank you. By the way, thank you so
you.
much. These were great points that you've made. I took some of my own notes. So I'd love to see from the audience any questions that folks have. I know we have a few mics that we can run around. We have a question in the front and the question back in the corner there. There's a couple of people over there, and we'll go around here. So why don't we start here? Yeah.
Hi. You talked about your experience while working at Jet about failing well together. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what did you instill in your environment and those around you that made that happen? Because I recognize it's probably very, very difficult to fail well together.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, could everybody hear his question? Yeah, okay, good. Look, like most tricky stuff in work environments, it's actually just about the human dynamics. I think the thing, and not just me, like we as a leadership team instilled is that like it's not about like pointing fingers and finding fault. And that's an easy thing to say, but that's a hard thing to do because often when things go badly, um, human nature is a little bit, I mean, look, I'm a lifelong Democrat, like we're eating our own young the last week. So, um, but I think it is around like, one, it's assembling a team that all thinks that way. I think that's really important. Like you can't fake good intentions indefinitely. And I think it is assembling a team that sort of starts and finishes by assuming good intentions on the part of everyone around them until proven otherwise. That's really critical. I think the other thing is if you are really outcome driven, then you can still do a postmortem and understand the why something didn't work without like getting into a situation of saying, oh, it's because this person like, effed up. But I also think it is a little bit just a byproduct of like growth mindset, meaning you're kind of on the like, how do we like fix and move on and what's next, as opposed to like constantly looking backwards. There is like another point I would make around Jet that I thought was part of how we were able to scale so quickly. A lot of startups and even larger companies fall into this trap of, I did not coin this term, it's Patty from Netflix, Patty McCord, which is organizational nostalgia. That is, you get to a point where you're like, we were 50 people, now we're 100. Oh, do you remember when everyone could fit in the same room?
Yeah.
Like, who cares? And I think that is actually part of failing well together, is actually saying like, what we're doing now is great. Let's keep the stuff that was good, but let's not get overly sentimental about it, because like it can't be the right answer to constantly be looking in the rearview mirror. And I think that is part of kind of the successful, constant movement forward in highly performant organizations. Sure.
Hi, I remember Jet certainly started with a big fanfare. I'm not a retail expert, but was there a time that people thought it would become the next what Amazon became? And was it a tough decision to sell to Walmart? And the other side of that is, after 8 years, did Walmart get what they thought they were going to get and wanted to get out of that acquisition?
Yeah. So was there a time? Yeah, I think it's possible. There are probably some startups that start with the idea of like, we're going to get acquired, but I don't think those are any startups started by Mark. He's a pretty ambitious guy. I thought, I know the company was formed with the idea that there shouldn't be like a monopoly in e-commerce, and that almost all of the innovation in e-commerce had been focused on price and not on experience or supply chain. And so we genuinely thought there was like a different and better way to do it. In some ways, it was a tough decision to sell to Walmart because I think in many tech startups, you can keep me honest, there is sometimes a sense of like selling is failing. But I think we really quickly got to a place where we said like, we always thought scale would be a great unlocker of the things we wanted to do. And if you want to like really see and get to scale quickly, having a canvas to paint on and a platform like Walmart is incredible. I mean, just an example of that, FedEx had been an investor in Stash. And I thought we had unbelievable FedEx rates because they were such a large investor. And then I got to Walmart and like it put almost 120 basis points straight to our bottom line when we shifted to their contract. Like it was unbelievable. And so when we started thinking about like, could we fulfill our mission better, faster, sooner as part of that organization, it became an obvious choice. Do I think Walmart got what they wanted? And do they feel 100%? Maybe 200%. And it sort of goes to Scott's question earlier, like, I think Doug, in his own way, is a visionary. Saying that unironically. I think he said this publicly, that like Amazon was eating their lunch in e-commerce, and like, why should that be the case? And they really, I think, wanted to buy Mark's brain, and many of the other folks around the table. We all ended up having broader jobs in Walmart for the time we were there, and they really wanted to infuse that DNA. And it changed the trajectory of the e-commerce business at Walmart and had a very positive impact on the value of the equity. So I think they were, as my dad would say, pleased as punch. I've never understood what that meant, but I like it.
Punch is pleasing, I guess.
I guess so.
We have a question from the online audience. Heather Friedland asks, what advice do you have for female operators and executives to pursue board roles?
Well, first and foremost, tell people you want them. I'm not joking about that. When the first board role I had was actually a public board I was on was Choice Hotels. And it was like the first time I could actually get a board role, because at BlackRock, you can't be on any boards because they own a piece of everything on the planet, not that secretly. But I was at E-Trade and I really wanted to be on a board, and recruiters were calling me for jobs. And every time I would talk to the recruiter, I'd say like, I'm really happy here, but I'd love to be on a board. And here are like the 2 or 3 things I think I'm uniquely good at. And here are the industries that I'm interested in. And you know, this is even truer now than it was then, because all these guys have databases. If you tell enough people that you're interested in boards, they start. Now, you also have to, I mean, be realistic about what kind of board you can be on. I have a friend who used to work at Goldman, and now she just recruits women for boards. And after I joined that board, I started getting calls for lots of other boards. This is like, of course, it's the most unfair thing in the planet, which is that people who are on boards get calls for boards, but people who aren't on boards don't get as many calls for boards, because people want people with board experience on their boards. It's a little bit of an Uber Ubus. And I had this conversation with her about like, oh, someday I'd like to be on the like Apple board. I don't even remember if that's what I said, but something like that. And she was like, NFW. She was like, you're not enough of a technologist. Like, that's just not appropriate for you. And whether that's true or not, it was actually a good.
Al Gore is a huge technologist, I guess.
He did invent the internet.
Oh, of course, that's right.
So like, there's a time and a place. I also think private boards, while they have an extremely different dynamic than public boards, extremely different dynamic, is actually like a good way to build the muscle of not stepping over the line into operating. And so, they often have like a lower threshold in terms of like previous board experience.
Okay, Anna's got one more in the back.
One more in the back.
How are you doing? My name is Kareem. So I was doing a little bit of research on Jet.com, and I saw that Michael Lohr, before founding Jet, founded, I think, Diapers.com and sold it to
Amazon.
Amazon. That's
Yes.
correct. So from your perspective, how did him founding that company and then selling to Amazon influence his idea to start Jet? And then how did that influence his idea to start Jet and then to execute on like the marketing and then strategy and operational side of that company as well? And then, sorry, I don't mean to ask too many
This is a
questions.
question with 42 subparts.
Nah, it was just, in your experience, was there anybody else that founded a company before and then started something new? And then, how did their former experience affect the latter?
So, I mean, the world is either rich or rife, depending on your perspective, with serial entrepreneurs. I think people get the bug of founding things, and whether they are successful or not, it is often just, I mean, as an investor, I often like seeing founders whose first foray hasn't been that successful, because like, failure is the forge. And it also keeps people hungry. I will tell you with Mark, and if he were here, I'm sure he would say this. Like, he didn't really want to sell to Amazon. They made him an offer he could not refuse in kind of the like most unpleasant way possible. And so I think that really doubled down on the fire in his belly to do something at scale that could compete with them. At least that is my interpretation. So I do think it had a dramatic influence on his thinking, and the fact that he also got to live inside of Amazon after they acquired Quidsy, which is the parent company of diapers.com. Also gave him an insight into their inner workings and mechanics. And I think he saw like ways they could be beat. But that is, again, my interpretation based on many conversations with him. But I do think serial entrepreneurship, you know, is like good disease. Like once people catch it, it's very hard to get rid of it.
Liza, thank you so much for joining
Thanks,
us this
Scott.
morning.
Very appreciate it.